things, and that'll be, I think, very practical. So one of the big issues is that we have a real trouble in our society and even in healthcare talking about suicide. My psychiatrist's view of that is that we don't really understand what life is, and therefore we don't really understand what death is, and everyone's afraid to talk about death. And so and suicide is even a further layer to that because, okay, so you ended your life, but what does that really mean? And so because of that, there's a lot of pejorative language around it. Most of the time, historically, we were all trained to say committed suicide. And quite frankly, the group that's working on this finds that very offensive because it sounds like the only other thing you can commit basically is a crime. So that's a problem. If they're moving on their own again.
No, that was me. Sorry.
Oh, that was you. Okay, no problem. So we try to say died by suicide. So that's fine. We try to say died by suicide. And we know from a lot of studies, the suicidologists who for years were in the ivory tower, literally not talking to healthcare professionals, they've now started to talk with us in the last 5 years or so. We know from studies that people aren't trying to die because, again, they don't really know what that means, and you have spiritual beliefs and so forth. They want to end pain, and that could be spiritual pain, physical pain, emotional pain, whatever kind of pain you might have, and that's really why they do something to try to take their own lives, and unfortunately, sometimes they do actually take their lives that way. This is not advancing.
Jamie. Try again.
Thank you. So I won't belabor it, but I want to at least throw out the most recent meta-analysis I could find around risk factors. And this one is not too old, from 2013. And they took a lot of studies, 19 studies. They actually, some places published more than one analysis. You get 28 publications out of it. And if you're in research, that's pretty smart use of your time. So the biggest predictor of suicide is past behavior, past suicide. That's true for most behaviors, including violence toward others and other things. Depression definitely falls into that. I'm going to get into that in the screeners. Hopelessness as a particular symptom within depression. Alcohol or drug use is a very high risk factor, particularly at the time, very disinhibiting often. Male, unfortunately, males continue to be a high risk factor. Men die by suicide much more frequently than women, and that's true in national data, international data, and even recently I looked at Summit County data, so that holds true about 4 to 1. Any comorbid mental illness, including anxiety, can increase the risk, and then no surprise, because of the genetic loading, a family history of psychiatric illness, and perhaps that even affects nurturing, because if your family, if your parents had mental illness, that may have affected how you learn coping skills and how you do the world. So this just gives you a fancier slide. I'm not going to review this in detail for time's sake, but just to point out the biological factors that are really involved. And really what we're talking about with screening is we're often looking for these proximal factors. We're trying to catch somebody because you can't, some of these factors are static, so you can't take away your family's history of mental illness, but you can deal with the current moment and try to catch somebody who is feeling hopeless, who is in some kind of severe pain, whatever that type of pain is. And then, of course, usually if they're seeing us in the health office, they're probably not having an immediate trigger, but maybe they have recently, and we catch that as well. So this just shows you, in Ohio, I just ran this actually on the official website. This shows you that within up to the age of 18, of the 10 leading causes of death, suicide does fall number 3, and it's a lot of people. You can see 10.4%. So way too many percent of that we don't want to see. Unintentional injury probably includes some people who actually died by suicide, but because of stigma and many other factors, we don't know. None of the medical examiners ever want to overcall that. So it might be actually higher than 10.4%. It may very well rival homicide, in fact, if you really look at the data carefully. So it's very, very high problem. This is called the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, and since we're zooming out across further than just Summit County, I wanted to give you the state one, and we're going to redo this in 2018, so this will have new data after this year. But this shows you the people, the percentage of students. So this is high school students, I believe, and this shows you how many people actually felt sad and hopeless. And if you look at it for 2 weeks in a row, it really meets the criteria, at least some of them, for major depressive episode, 25.8%. That's a lot of people. And in fact, in Summit County, when we did this, we got about 30%. So it's a terribly high risk group. Now look at how many of them actually attempt suicide, and it ranges in there, but somewhere, most recently 6.2%. Unfortunately, in Summit County, it was closer to 10% of 1,900 students in middle and high school that we had taken in Summit County. That's a lot of people, right? I mean, I'm glad they're not grabbing more lethal means like a gun, because that, of course, means we have a lot more deaths. So the nation took notice of this not long ago, actually 2010, and said, we got to do something about this. The rates were on the rise. We had dropped them down to about 11.1 per 100,000, and they started to creep back up, and they got together and said, let's do something. And that something is called zero suicide in healthcare. And again, we say in healthcare because we're not going to necessarily affect everybody in society, but we should try to screen for and catch people that come to our care. And whether that's an ER, a primary care office, a psychiatry office, psychology office, what have you, we should catch those people if we can and do something about it. Did that. So what we're trying to do is change attitudes. It's really been someone else's job, usually my job, if you will, the psychiatrist or Dr. Weiss's job, right? Everybody tries to funnel them, but there aren't enough of us. So it needs to be everybody's job. We have to shift to realistic optimism. We can save a lot of lives if we do this well. And I'm going to show you an example of where they've done this and it has worked. So it's real. It's not just a pipe dream. It needs to be comprehensive. It needs to be a continuity of caring from, hey, you need more care right this moment, and maybe for the next several weeks, or the average is probably 3 months, and then we can go back to your usual care, unless you have another episode that we catch. And hopefully by then the person realizes, hey, they can do something to help me. So they'll actually step up faster than us even having to screen for it. And this idea of it's part of what we do, it's everybody's job. And to play psychiatrist for one more second, I really believe, and a lot of people say this, people who went into healthcare professions, it may be a high level of coping with a fear of death. And so what do? You choose a profession where you fight death every day. And I would argue, I think probably successfully if I spent more time, it's preventing death by suicide would be high on the list of accomplishing that goal that many of us went into healthcare for. So right now we have a system. In effect, the cheese is all arranged the same way, which means there are holes, and somebody can actually fall through the hole if you don't do the screening, if you don't take concrete steps for safety, if you don't treat suicidality as its own entity, not as part of their depression or as part of their schizophrenia or anxiety. It is its own entity, and that's the suicidologists have helped us there a lot. And then this continuity of caring, and I'll come back to that briefly in the last moments here. Otherwise, if we don't do that, the people fall through the holes or the cracks, and you end up with death. So this just shows you what we could do. Screening, which we're going to focus on today. Collaborative safety plans. This is not the same thing as a safety contract where my patient signs a letter saying, yes, I will never kill myself. Those have zero evidence base. Collaborative safety plans have a very high evidence base, and they're very different. I'll show you one of those. Treating suicidality as its own entity. Again, we have things for that. Cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, and collaborative assessment and management of suicide, which was actually created by a suicidologist, Dr. David Jobs, who we brought to town, in fact. And then follow-up, which has extreme. So here, one example, there's many, but here's one. So this is in the Henry Ford Health System in our neighboring state, Michigan. Captive audience, if you will, an HMO, working families where they wouldn't have this plan, so it's a fairly homogeneous group in that respect. And look where they were. The national average today is about 13 people per 100,000 die by suicide. They were at 110. Wow, right? So they said, we got to do something. They actually went after depression. They didn't go after suicidality directly. They called it perfect depression care. And you can see the effects when they do something right. They actually hit zero in 2009, hence the term zero suicide. I believe I heard they did that again in 2014. So that is tremendous change because of a systematic approach, not about individual clinicians, it's a system. Okay, so we're going to make this a responsibility, at least in healthcare. Systematic, which I highlighted here, is really the most important part. So I'll come back to that some more. So Lethal means restriction is important. You know, obviously that's in the news as we speak because of the terrible shooting in the Florida school with no less than an assault rifle again. But any lethal means restriction is very effective. There's great evidence, and yet, unfortunately, it gets caught up in politics. So we have to try to fight back as healthcare professionals against that. Forget the party you're with. It's about helping people and saving lives. So these are the 7 principles of zero suicide. I'm only going to do one of these today. But you need leadership to really take this and make this important. You need to train people. So right now, if you look at people, many would say they were not trained to adequately ask somebody if they are thinking of suicide. And if they get a yes, they really don't know what to do. So guess what? Human nature, we don't ask very well. And that's one of the big things we train people. If you ask well, which you'll only do if you have a handoff system, a system. So I can it's not going to be the psychiatrist. I'm going to hand it to somebody who's trained in CAMS or DBT or CBT, and they're going to take the ball and run with that for that relatively brief period of time to help the person. I'm going to still be part of the team, as many of us were talking about team care, would still be part of the team, engaging everybody around this suicide management plan that becomes their part of their treatment plan. Treatment, again, that's probably a topic in the future. How do you transition people from a crisis text or from a phone call or from your ER or so forth? And I will tell you, of all of these, the highest evidence base is this transition point. If you use text, email, snail mail, postcards, at least those, and phone. I haven't seen smoke signals yet, but it's probably out there somewhere. If you use any of those features within like 2 days of one of those for transition, you know how much it decreases the next suicide attempt rate? Drops it 50%. It's almost free. So we're working on that in Summit County, hoping to get many agencies to at least do that. And that is the best evidence of all these. That's the most, because this is new. This is something that we're trying to do now as a nation because it's important. And then improve. Obviously, everything we do now, we need to analyze the data and make a feedback. I'll mention zerosuicide.org because it has huge resources, every bit of it free. And it really, I just went through the website the other day again in case people had questions. Very robust, has free screening tools, which I'm going to go into now for time's sake, as well as assessing your workforce to see how they feel ready, assessing your system to see how ready it is, and so forth. And they do have a Zero Suicide Academy for agencies who really want to get on board. They do a training for you, several-day training and so forth. So the task force recently, the U.S. Preventive Task Force, back in just in 2016, said, hey, you should be screening everybody in primary care, right? So we're focused in this echo on this age group. Adolescents ages 12 to 18 should be screened for major depressive disorder. And again, I'm going to show you a screen of several things in a moment. There's not enough information yet, according to them, to say for 11 or younger. You may find some pediatric offices are doing 11 and up, but in general, there's no official evidence it's strong enough, but it is strong enough from 12 to 18. And so they call this a recommended practice. And the highest is an A, but a B is also recommended, so it gives it a B. There are other letters that would not make the grade. No pun intended. So just to show you real fast, this is the Henry Ford one. When they created this, that they actually got to 0. You'll notice that the top piece is actually about alcohol. So alcohol is a depressant, so they went after that because they were in depression. They asked about drugs, because as I said, that's a high risk factor. And then the section 3 is all about depressive symptoms, the usual big ones that we think about, although not all 9 are on there, but it's got 5 of them. This is called the Ask Suicide Screening Questionnaire. This is being promoted by the National Institutes of Mental Health. Again, very well vetted. It's got a lot of evidence behind it now. It's very straightforward. These are not meant to take a lot of your time, and it could be literally on the clipboard, or maybe it's the nurse who sees the person. As I go to see my primary care doctor, the nurse talks to me first real fast, weighs me, which I hate, then we move on. And she can do this, or he could do this. So it asks if you, in the last few weeks, again, we're looking at that current kind of status, not what happened years ago. Have you wished you were dead? Have you felt your family would be better off if you were dead? How about in the past week, have you had actual thoughts of killing yourself, and if so, how? That's really fuel. That's not the screen. That's really the fuel for this conversation. And then, have you ever tried to kill yourself? Again, why is that? past history. If you've tried it before, your risk on my list goes way up to the top, and you should be worried about that. And then there are steps that you can go through. We'll make this obviously available to everybody. This is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline risk assessment documentation. Just to give you a sense of how much they ask on that phone. When somebody calls in, this is not really a screener per se, because this is more detailed than you're going to do in your primary care office. But this just gives you a sense of the range of things. Try to get a sense of your desire, as they call it. Are you capable? Do you have the means? Are you really, what are you doing with that? Who can you reach out to, though, when you feel this way? And then the buffers, connectedness. The Air Force has used social connectedness. They're another group that's really dropped the suicide rate, separate from the whole VA process that's working on it right now. Long before that, they were doing that. So we are social animals, and that social connectedness is a huge buffer for people. This is probably the most evidence-based. This is the Columbia suicide risk screening, and there's several versions, a much more lengthy version. This is the screener, and they try to normalize it. It's a good approach to doing this. It is a fact that nearly everyone has at some time felt hopeless. That's A. Tell us if you've been feeling hopeless, right? That's much more normalizing than kind of out of the blue asking this question. B, it's also a fact that many people have had thoughts of ending their lives. This is the kind of question they ask women in postpartum times, because it's very common that women at some point feel like throttling their newborn, right? They got sleep in, the kid's fussing, they're crying, and women don't ever talk about that. And that's a travesty, because some do go down a very dark path. So same idea here. You see the drugs and alcohol in there for the same reason. Okay, and then this is another one, and I just pulled it up, and I can't see the title, unfortunately. But anyway, another one that gives you, is very evidence-based as well, and it gives you a risk screening based on these questions. These are not rocket science questions. It just structures it in a way that you can then really ask it, and it becomes normal, because if you ask this every time I go in to see my doctor, eventually I'm going to be, oh, that's normal, right? So that makes sense. This is an example that these can be embedded into an electronic record. This is called the PHQ-9. Again, not rocket science. There are 9 potential symptoms, of which you must have 5 to meet criteria for major depressive episode. These are those 9 symptoms. This is very quick. My own son had this done on a clipboard when I took him in 6 months ago. I was very happy that the doctor did this. In fact, one of them is interesting. It said, the way it was worded wasn't quite this good, but it said something like, do you have little interest or pleasure in doing multiple things? And he said, well, Dad, yeah, I have a little interest in a lot of stuff. And I said, tell that to the doctor. And he did. And it was a much better discussion than just no, thankfully, in this case. So that's important. This is a very well-used tool at many places. Although the Columbia is the most evidence-based, this is the most commonly adopted right now in primary care settings. And if not this, then this. If 9 questions is too much, go for 2. The Patient Health Questionnaire 2 has that initial, have you felt down, depressed, or hopeless? And then have you felt that little interest or pleasure in doing things? Either of those, bang, you better do more, right? Some people do a PHQ-3, but they don't call it that. They'll ask the other question, are you thinking about killing yourself? So they'll do that last of the 9 just to be really complete, which I actually favor the PHQ-3 in my mind, but I can see why you only got 10 minutes or something for a primary care type visit. You don't want to spend a lot of time, but you want to catch these people. That's our job, right? Okay, so finally, resources. Lots of resources you can provide to youth and families, so I wanted to give this as a practical thing. We've got a suicide prevention lifeline, which I mentioned, their screen or what they'll ask. But I think equally important, or maybe more so in today's world, is the crisis text line. A lot of these youth are much more likely to use a text line, and there are live people standing by who've been trained to work with youth to text back and engage. And of course, because they're texting from a phone, they can swoop in, they can get the 911 there if they need to, so you can still get that easy access to save somebody in a crisis, but you're hoping to tie them into resources and so forth. And we're actually monitoring that from our board to see how all the calls that come in our region. And it's very useful information that we're then feeding back. I mentioned Zero Suicide. The Suicide Prevention Resource Center, which is tied to Zero Suicide, is also a very good resource. The National Alliance for Mental Illness, a lot of information, particularly around families, helping loved ones who may be at risk for suicide, a parent's guide, and then another suicide prevention program for youth. So that gives you a lot. Project Aware is that last one. It promotes coping strategies. It's more of a preventive. Let's teach coping strategies, and it's an Ohio creation, and it's getting a lot more press just recently. So it's relatively new compared to these other ones. So, and with that, I will take questions. I don't know how much time I spent.